ethical issue has been the center stage for all of us ever since the subprime crisis hit, and the world took serious cognizance of what ethics means to business. While this was an issue which has always been largely out there, and people talked about it in very soft terms, in terms of how the best practices they do in terms of CSR activities, but when this hit, it hit as close and it could hurt badly. So we thought, while we were looking at the subjects before us, that we should look at how ethical executive leadership is very important for employees today. This is a subject that we've been routinely dealing with when we come also with our best companies to work for. It's a question that we ask employees about, how do they value ethical cues in their boss and in their organization, and routinely we find that this is a subject that comes up right up there, along with other issues that are close, such as remuneration. I in fact had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Sanjay Sen, and he talked about how ethics has evolved in time, how we looked up to goals, we looked at different role models, and then how it was about maximizing, getting the work done at any cost. So maybe I can open this conversation with you. So very interesting conversation about how these things have evolved over time, from Gandhiji having role models to about me and myself. How do you see ethics evolving within organizations and leaders?
Thank you. Just as an outset, what's the role of executive leadership, apart from leading organizations or leading their teams? An important role that they play is that of being a role model, and for people, when we look at all of us, when we are in school, at home, we all have role models, teacher, parents, or something. When we move into working life, at that point in time, are role models from before? Are there? What is relevant for us is role models in the workplace. So that is an important role that executive leadership has. If you go back to in the Indian context, when we had soon after India became independent, who were our role models in industry? Our role models in industry were people who stood for something beyond themselves, so for a higher order, the larger one. So we went through that phase, and then there was an entire generation that were looking at them as role models. As time progressed, we had the role models changed, where people said, now it's more about me, and it's not how you do it's what you get done. What you get done by any means, the cotton geckos of the world. So that was seen as the role model.
Means not being important, the end being more important.
Right. So we went through that cycle, and then it had its obvious fallouts. So now, I think where we have gone on to the cycle of saying, enough of that, we tried that out, let's look at something beyond. Let's look at how the work is to be done. So people in organizations now look for those sort of role models. Let's look at people who can be a symbol to us about how work is done rather than what, and people who can be symbols to us or working towards a goal beyond themselves or the organizations or the community. So I think we're going through that phase in society itself, if you look at the political arena and all that, and that gets reflected even in the organization.
Mr. Singh, it is interesting that while we are talking about this, your company actually went right out there in its advertisement and talked about, Aapke Sache Advisor. So, it was, you sort of nailed it beautifully in the campaign and talked about how there was a lot of rampant mis-selling. you took ownership of that cause and you put it right there. So, you know, will you like to take us through a journey of, before you put the campaign on, was there any internal thinking or any sort of specific exercise that the organization took to train its people to actually make the, you know, talk walk?
Allow me to step back and actually share a broader context
Sure.
in terms of the ethical leadership. There are 2-3 takes that I want to share in terms of the panelists here. To me, and I'll take a slightly broader view, ethics is inseparable from leadership. So that's one view that I take. I think it's deeply embedded within leadership. Because leadership is not just about leadership at a point of time. Leadership has a longer time frame. When I think of a leader, it's difficult to believe that a leader can exist without followers. That's the second thing. So a leader has no followers, and therefore, when we talk about Gandhi, for example, you're referring to that, some other big leaders. Those are the kind of names that come to us, who have stood the scrutiny of test of time, who have stood the scrutiny of test of ethics over several phases, and who have been by and large selfless, who are people who have actually practiced what they have preached. In terms of, I'm trying to pick some common threads in terms of the leadership. And when I look at an organizational context, and thankfully it's a pleasure to see that this discussion actually is resonating today, not just in the corporate domains but in our social life as well, all across the world. In the emerging markets, I think it has been a bit of a challenge for us, a bit of Maslow's here, where as we have grown and moved from survival to more prosperity, some of these have become a lot more relevant than they were perhaps, decades ago. And it's a great thing to happen. It's a great thing to have choices, and it's a good to apply ethics and pursue what we think is appropriate as a society, as Indians, as a nation. So with that kind of a context, I'm talking of the insurance sector in our context of Max Life. We clearly saw, and for those who are familiar with this sector, it's a sector which is very heavily regulated. One. And there is background to that because about 5-6 years back, there was a whole lot of mis-selling that happened, particularly ULIPs, got sold, and there were a lot of dreams sold to customers about X and Y kind of returns, particularly high returns. And those didn't come to fruition. And the customers felt let down, so obviously the government and the regulator clamped down. And rightly so. And micromanaged the sector. Thankfully, the sector also responded beautifully to this challenge and took it in the stride. And today has really consolidated and made a lot of changes. If I look across the sector at bigger players, there are a lot of innovative practices that have happened across. But talking particularly about our Sachi Advisor campaign, from Max Life, we clearly saw that a focus on the short term is really going to take us nowhere. Not just we as an individual player, but the entire sector. We got to win back trust, which is so key to ethical leadership anywhere. We got to win the trust, whether it is customers or whether it is followers in the context of the leader. It is important that trust is established, and to do that, we got to bring in transparency. To do that, we got to exactly lay out how it's going to play. We got to insist on customers reading documents. We got to detail out to them the pros and cons of them, of the policy to them, so that they exactly see what they will land up with. They will see and weigh the risks involved and make this as transparent as possible. And fortunately, for us, as we have walked this down, inside the organization, this message has resonated very well. So we launched an initiative called Service Excellence as an example, where we are also engaging with our employees and talking about how should we be treating our customers. How quickly, promptly should we respond? Is every employee seeing himself or herself as a brand ambassador? So there is a cultural change that we are driving internally as well, and a conviction, collective conviction inside the organization that we are trying to build, so that we are consistent. And we have taken this to an extent where we've said if your claim is not settled within a certain day, we will pay a penalty. So we are continuing to raise the bar ourselves from the perspective of transparency to win the customer trust. And such an advisor campaign is just one piece of it, where we are touching the customers directly and making this very, very useful. But I think what is key here is for any leadership to sustain over a period of time, it has got to be ethical. It has got to be transparent. It has got to win the trust of the customers in the larger organization.
Sure, actually I would like to engage you a little more on that point, but before I do that, I would like to rope in Sanjay Singh and do you sort of, here is a case of a sales fronted organization where they were able to articulate this whole issue of ethics and trust. How does it work? How to create something as nebulous as that, which is at some level a very personal value to being articulated in the workplace, and it's very difficult. And as he at some point mentioned, it's a choice. Getting somebody to exercise that choice. So it's also a choice at some level. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. Before I do that, let me, like Shailesh said, open the context about where we operated. Sanjay talked about leaders and followers. As leaders, we are responsible. And if I take Remit to the corporate world, where do our corporations work today? What is the context? If you look at across the world, so there is a huge trust deficit running with people and those who are in power. Whether it is about corporates, whether it is about governments, or whether it's about politicians. So then this is not India phenomenon, it is global. I mean, there was a brief reference to which you made to what happened with the banking crisis across the world. Bankers were not well regulated, but as they lost the trust of the world at large, governments across the world clamped down. So we have a license to operate in any sector. And if we don't respect that license, which comes from the people, the communities that we work around with, and of course, the ecosystem of entire corporation, if we don't have that license to operate, we will just not, as either a corporation or industry, we will run into serious trouble. And there's been time and time again, and if you look at the political situation in the country, many other countries, there was this one person sitting with Wall Street. All these movements in this emerging country like India, a developed country like US, these are all symptoms where people at large want to hold people in power to a much higher accountability. And that's, let's say, for corporates. In this context, what is the role of leaders? And there's a point which we said that leaders at the top, like Sanjay, you said, they drive a role modeling. There are some parts which are very simple, which is the blacks and whites. If you get into the black, I mean, there's only one way for you to go. How do you take action on that? And then, for me, what we do a lot is, how do you define what is the brain? Which part of brain is something which you should do, which you should not do? It is about developing that judgment. In fact, I was just thinking, as Shailesh was talking, is that we're running a series of workshops internally, which are actually run by consulting from outside. They will take in cases from our history of what is wrong, what is right. What do you mean by the conflict of interest in operating in? What does sharing of information mean? What is right, what is wrong? It is when you start the tone at the top by looking at those examples which really matter. And the interesting part when we had the feedback, people said these are the right examples because in a group of 20, there were some people who said, I think left, some said I think right. That means we're talking about the real grey areas. And that's the part. Every organization, whether corporate or otherwise, will have their own context. The point I want to make is, how do we educate ourselves to build that instinct, build that leadership point of view that if I'm confronted with something which is big, I have a way forward. I have an ecosystem to guide me. I have a value system to guide me. And I've got training which helps me say that this is the way we do things here. We no longer work in a situation where people are, we get hired and we retire at the same time. We have people joining certainly in our system from across the world. How do you engage the entire leadership into one framework around what is right? So this, to me, is absolutely crucial. I want to make that if we miss the context, we will pay dearly for that. Second, the tone at the top, enabled with various methods of doing it, is absolutely important. So no one is left in doubt what is expected of you and what will not be accepted.
Thank you so much. Nina, I wanted to bring you in at the very last because I really want you to act on my behalf and provoke our panelists into saying something interesting for our session. He talked about the fact that there were no, it was not regulated the way it should have been regulated, the banking industry. So at some level, there is a need for that template. And you increasingly find big organizations having a very important, seeking for compliance officers. So, at some level, it is out there, like your CIO or CMO, there is the Chief Compliance Officer in most organizations, there's a great need. How do you see that, how do you see companies seeking out people for that level? What is it? Is it just the financial aspect right now that they are very involved with, or do you see that filtering down at different levels? What's your experience been?
Yeah, so I think before I come to your specific question, I just want to share, I want to play the devil's advocate here, and I'm just very tempted to do that. There are a lot of things which lie in the domain of good to do. Here is ethical leadership, this is how we define it, this is how we say it should be, but to what extent does it follow? And to what extent are we aware what lies in the grey zone as we like to talk about? So a lot of times we found that there are people who are caught in the crossfire of an ethical dilemma. And I actually don't know the answer. And this is where you bring in a compliance officer or an auditory mechanism, or you audit firms, and you find instances where I am struggling with the ethical dilemma, and who do I really go to? And really, there are very far and few between cases which actually get resolved. But I remain there. So what happens is, then you go back to that role modeling that something you talk about, and you actually look up to those leaders and say, hey, here's a role model, and he's my manager, or my super manager, as the case may be. And I ought to be able to take a leaf out of his experience book and be able to do the things the way he's doing. But oftentimes in the corporate India, we're not so sure whether he himself is doing the right thing. So there becomes, the dilemma gets worse as we go along. I want to just stop this conversation for a moment and move to another piece, which is something that I struggled with last year, and I want to share the experience with all of you. Maybe it brings in a different thinking. So here I am with an internationally renowned researcher, decorated academician, talking about research of what do successful leaders look like. And here's a CEO plus. So we're really talking about a level which governs, defines, are those so-called role models. And you know what he said to me is very interesting. You have to bear with me for a moment on this one. He says there are 5 cues that define, success at the top. And you can say what success is. In today's day and age, I don't think we need to put our blinders on what success is. It's really about performance in business numbers as we're talking about. So those 5 cues are IQ, as we all are familiar with. Resilience quotient, so he called it RQ. He talked about something called EQ, which again we are familiar with. He talked about political quotient, which is PQ. And last but not the least, he talked about a moral quotient. So he says, here are the 5 Qs. And he asked me to do this exercise with him, and later he shared the research findings with me. Which is to say, he says, okay Nina, here you are sitting in hydrate. Now what do you think should become more or become less as you aspire for the top job? So here I am sitting with all these value systems intact, and I'm saying, well, IQ should remain good and it has to be strong to begin with. RQ, resilience, yes, you need it in this, tough times that we all live in. PQ, well, I'll reserve my judgment. It has negative connotations, it has positive connotations. EQ, I said it should be more, I have to look after the entire organization going forward. And MQ, wow, it has to be the best. You don't let go of your morals at any point of time. So this is what I said to him. He said, you're so naive and you're so out there on your own. And I said, okay, so what did I miss out? And I'm not getting this. So can you imagine what was shared with me, which is coming out of success, a very, very recognized, research, documented fact, where he says, well, IQ, yes, it has to be constant or more. RQ, constant or more. Your EQ ought to come down. Fine, I can take that with a punch. Well, you've got to take hard decisions at the top. You can't be the soft feeling EQ guy. The next one he talked about is the PQ, and he says if you look at it in the right thing, you've got multiple stakeholders, you've got this environment, you've got vested interests in the boards. Let's say this also has to go up. Fine, I'm willing to bite that. But he said the MQ of the guys who've been successful, right at the top, has to be lower. And that is where it really clashed with my value system, and that's where I just couldn't handle it anymore. And I researched the whole piece, I read through the whole kind of, who were the people who were, part of the survey, what were they saying, what were the questions, was it just pilot size, was it only large organizations, was it only a certain kind of organizations. I did my entire thinking, but I realized that success today, we got to be real about it, and this is what it shows up. Now, I don't know, we can struggle with it, and it's very thought-provoking for me. I struggle with it. I actually talked to a few people in the industry, and I said, this is what I'm hearing. Am I completely wrong? Is he wrong? And I actually struggle with this. And I'll leave it to the panel to say, where does this go? So whilst we can say all these great things about ethical leadership and how it should be X, Y, Z, let's talk about practicing it, and let's talk about where does it get embodied. And if success is what means, and which is what I've shared with you, if this is what it means, then well, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, that was something that I was struggling to nail, and you did it so beautifully, saying that, the moral quotient, and how do you nail it, because it's so nebulous and out there that the old-fashioned or the traditional way that it's been perceived is that ethics and business don't go hand in hand, which is not the cues that we are getting from all the other parameters and the society that we see, and the Gen Y that's coming into workplace, that those are not what they want or seek. So how do you, resolve this? How do you go about nailing it? How do you make the talk walk?
Fact of life, yes, that is the current scenario. Fact of the matter is that when you're talking of being a role model, it's about continuing to do something in the face of adversity consistently. So how many leaders can do that when the quarter result is down, or when my boss is beating down on me and saying, fine, this is good, the how stuff, but where's the what? Where is the return?
So, just to interrupt you, so how does it begin? Let's take it from the beginning. When you hire somebody, obviously you screen the candidate on all the ethical parameters. There's a hygiene check that most big companies do today, and that is non-negotiable when you hire somebody. But thereafter, how do you ensure that it's penetrating down? There is an explicit understanding of what is acceptable, what is not. How do you take a call when somebody is driving the team too hard on goal achievement, and how is that goal achievement happening? Are those issues you get involved with? Do organizations get involved with?
Absolutely right, and that's really the biggest challenge. So you can do all our screening tests, do the background, you look at the past record, and you see evidence of that. But once they come in, the important thing is that how do you reinforce it? How do you make sure? And so there are two parts of it. One is, as I mentioned, the ecosystem. What helps is that it takes a long time, as you say, building it up. So in our example, we are in one form or the other, the organization is about 80 years old. And 80 years old, we sort of stood the test of time because you haven't heard about our organization, a group of companies, have ever come up with these ethical issues being in the forefront. So we have that overall ecosystem, so that's an advantage. But then again, once you get the person in, the challenge is how do you constantly have to reinforce it, especially for the leaders. And really there's no substitute beyond consistently doing it. There's no substitute beyond finding examples, not just in leadership, because what happens over a period of time is you're always looking up and saying, that's my role model. They have to they have to conform to a certain.
Them and not about how.
Yeah. What is it that I have to do? There's something that I can do. A classic example, previous one was talking about this whole thing about environment. And everybody was saying that the admin or somebody else need to make sure that the environment is better, and somebody else that they need to keep the place clean. And there was this one lady, an assistant, she was the junior most in the and what she did was quietly, she just, when she would leave at the end of the day, the desk would be absolutely clean. When she would, there was information asked for, she would think ahead and see what is it the customer wants. If there is information, if there is knowledge she had, she would proactively do it. Quiet example. Over a period of time, people found that she was embodying all the values that we want to. So, then the trick is to get it across to people right across that find it as a role model, but what is the ownership that I am taking? And there's something I can do in my circle of influence.
So make people at different levels heroes, not just restricted to the top creamy layer in the organization or the top layer. Coming back to you, I would want to engage you. Insurance is again, it's a hard environment where targets are very important. Routinely, people are pushed to meet their targets. How have you broken that template down at that level to ensuring that people do not behave in a way that they are not supposed to? How have you broken that down to ensure that trust resonates and stays? Internally, have you had to do any sort of change?
Sure. I think the two are linked, so I will kind of build on what you just shared and also maybe respond to what you just pointed out in the context of the sector. So first and foremost, it doesn't come easy. This one doesn't come easy and doesn't come soon. It takes time. And as I think some of the other panelists just pointed out, this is generally top down. It begins with that conviction. This is not the security guard who creates culture. It is the CEO and the leadership team that create culture, and that too not overnight over a period of time. First, I think that's something which is kind of very obvious, very vivid, very clear, and yet not easy to really implement. Because this requires consistency of effort. This requires conviction. This requires the conviction to truly build an institution versus running a business. And there is a very clear line between the two. The business focus is a lot of times very, very short-term oriented versus the institution creation that we strive to make. And we have to be very clear that we are on a tough path. It may mean some compromises in the short term, but it requires conviction from the leadership that we got to pursue this goal. There will be significant hurdles. There will be always 5 reasons pointing out from a financial cost perspective as deterrents or hurdles on this path, but it requires strong conviction. Someone has rightly said actually, honesty is not just a good policy, it's a good strategy. And it is so profound. If we were to take a holistic view of any strategy, short term and long term, if it pays, it is sound. And this one truly pays long term. For 2-3 reasons in the context of insurance sector also. One, you are actually practicing what you preach. So, there is a general harmony that you create in the organization. You're not creating anomalies, you're not creating gaps, you are truly minimizing the gaps. And to that extent, if there are extreme sales targets to sales folks, which is a reality in this very competitive sector, alongside what we've also got to enforce, and this is done in different ways, but what we got to enforce is not one person should step outside the line of integrity, the line of ethics, truly put customer orientation ahead of it, and recognize and reward people for that behavior. Saying is one thing, but actually practicing, recognizing that behavior, rewarding them, creating an ecosystem of leaders and people around which believes in this is the true test. And this again happens over a period of time. It does not happen overnight. It requires reinforcement, it requires consistent and constant communication by the senior leadership every day, every week in all the fora that they are interacting with, and their actions must speak for them. their actions must be louder than their words.
Isn't that a very
It is, but it depends on what one is setting out for.
especially in a situation where you do have people coming and going, so you do have a bit of a addition to
Yeah.
new sector like insurance, and you are going to have but every instance the leader needs to walk the talk, etc., and then you got to kind of espouse those values very genuinely, probably live the values.
Yeah.
So isn't that very? I mean, how do you kind of?
I'll tell you how it works beautifully. This is how this caravan gets bigger. You can actually see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that's the guiding force. As you get success, as customers, you have the confidence of customers, as there are pockets of excellence in the organization, and as you reinforce these, the believers increase over a period of time. And that is key. One has to stay on course, one has to really see, I know there will be hurdles, and I know longer term this is what will make us work. Now, think of this. If there are in an organization hundreds of people with hundreds of styles, what culture does is beautifully align people in values. That's essentially what culture does. And therefore people tend to sort of think in a certain consistent manner and agree to a certain form of ethics.
Here are some outliers here, and how do you deal with that from an HR perspective?
So, there are several examples that one encounters every day, including, for example, the most common example that one can think of is a leader who, based on we heard a discussion around competencies, we talked about the 5 Qs, and competencies, I think, are crucial to succeed, particularly in the short term. But longer term, unless they are blended with the how, which is the values, it is not just the what, but the how that is blended with, the longer term success will always be a question mark. Now, in the context of the example, if there is a leader, sales leader, who's been performing quarter after quarter, year after year, superstar. However, you do figure out this person is not the best person in terms of leading the team. The person has significant graphics, almost bordering on integrity issues, almost bordering on pushing products to customers. Here is a tough call that the organization needs to make. And we make those calls where we are very clear and we engage with leaders and let them know that while we love the performance, but this performance can't come with these strings attached and will not be palatable to us as an organization. And we make examples of those cases and we talk about those cases in open forum with our employees, where we exactly understand what is appropriate and what is not appropriate from our organization. And that's what culture is.
That's interesting. Do you have anything to share? Because there's also this whole thing of collusion of different age groups that come into a workplace. How does it?
I have a rather simpler take on this. For me, the whole point of ethical leadership or ethics starts with intent. If the intent is not there, there's no discussion about the person. Let's say in the case that there is intent to be ethical. Let's say that case. There will be these challenges in our point out that people who will in some time who are pursuing the short term or doing something which is in the gray zone. The blacks and whites are relatively easier to handle. What I've seen is that time catches on. There will be an event where this thing catches on, like the proverbial sales head. There have been people I've known in my working life where time catches on as an event. Things build to a point where someone, it could be the CEO, the board, something happens internally, externally, and someone says, this thing cannot go on. That triggers a debate. So, in some manner, I'm a little more optimistic about this because this process is self-correcting. The challenge, however, is what you see building up somewhat negatively every day comes crashing one fine day. But then the whole thing resets. Because when that event happens, it is fundamental. Everyone looks at it and says, okay, this is no longer acceptable. Whether it's leaders, CEOs, boards, everyone takes notice. So that's one point. To build this intent forward, intent and role modeling alone is not enough. I mean, and we Shailesh talked about how you recognize these things. It's also equally important. The first point that you raised is, like everything else, it's got to have processes, it's got to have measures, it's got to have a governance mechanism. For example, in case any whistleblowing complaint, even if it was not investigated, is every quarter shared with the board, the audit, even if it is frivolous and wise. The point being, and similarly, how do you address this point of, are we moving the needle? And we share it also with numbers in terms of what is the number, what is the volume. So it sends the clear intent of what is the scope of our intent. This is what we want as an organization. And then of course with the enabling system like recognizing people for values, having a go-to person and so on and so forth. But for me, it is key is intent and having the processes and governance that make sure it happens. And then, once there is something which goes out of that, you have to take the call in the organization. And if you don't, usually somewhere in the ecosystem, someone will take a call. And it could be on the whole organization as such, or industry if it is a bigger one. So I think, I'm not as pessimistic on that as you said, Tina. That's how industry acts.
Yes, it's interesting that you say that intent is very important, and I do agree that intent is, you have to begin somewhere, and intent is important. Except that research has consistently shown that very often, employees, people can be very ethical, but when it comes to work, they tend to sort of split the two roles very easily and say that, I'm doing this for my work, I'm doing this because this is required of me. Personally, I may be very scrupulous, and it becomes a dilemma there. So and you have pointed to the fact that as an organization, you're taking it up.
I just want to make one point: that research is very important. A lot of respect for it, but research also looks at event from a post facto. We have to recognize that a lot of the debate on ethics is very new. It's happened a lot in the last 10 years, and it did in earlier time. If we could fast forward in time and look at research on this 10 years down the line, I will bet there will be a different conversation. So I'm saying research is great, but let that not be the only thing, especially when the environment is still at a nascent formative stage. Research would not be my beacon for this.
At this stage, I would like to throw open the floor for questions. The audience has been patiently listening, and this has to be about knowledge sharing. So if any of you has any question for any specific member in the panel, you're free to ask them. Please do, in that case, be specific about who the question is. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, absolutely. My self-correcting point was more in reference to what was said that research shows that to be an effective leader, the moral quotient is something which you have grown now. But I completely agree with you that as long as you have the intent that this is the kind
Sanjay, I'm sorry, I'll have to stop here. So research was already done, survey was already done. These were the findings.
That's what I mean.
Success.
Findings of success. Yes.
So it's not that you're researching, you're post facto declaring.
Yes. That's what I mean. So that was the bad point. However, as far as I'm concerned, that if there is an intent that this is the kind of leadership that doesn't work in our company, and if people are leaving or people are complaining, you will hear it. Then it becomes a choice how you want to deal with it. You may want to coach, you may want to take action, you may want to do a variety of things which every organization usually does. And if you take, it's like any other decision. If you delay a decision beyond a point, you will pay the price for it. There is no getting away from it. So the self-correcting is not for this. The self-correcting is more on the ecosystem point of view that as leaders, this is the way forward. I don't believe that. And I think research few years down the line could perhaps, who knows, show that this is not the way forward for effective leaders.
Yeah, anyone? Yeah, lady there.
See, my question is for the sake of Max. See, we are part of the great times when, clean image and transparency sells. We appreciate that, and that goes that we are going towards the right direction, and maybe 10 years later when research really happens, it will show the effect of it. But we make cartoons for so many reasons. We need to police ourselves as an industry. Efforts are done, but yes, we make cartoons for our self-interest. But I think it's time that we should make cartoons for ethical reasons, for reasons which are more social in nature, which is not really happening. So if you would like to add on to that factor. And second part was, when you said, that results. I am a strong believer of Pareto's principle, 20-80. So your efforts will bring in results, no matter what. So whether you are doing, ethically, unethically is different part. But I've seen over the years that if you put efforts, it will bring in that kind of results. That 80-20, factor remains. If a person is putting 100% result, accordingly, results will be there. But more on the first part, that if we can work, talk about policing ourselves as an industry.
So what your question basically was, other than the business, there should be, even on the social, larger thing.
In terms of how can all the players together come together, agree to thresholds, some of what's mandated by the regulator in the customer interest, but going beyond and actually raising the bar on ourselves from a self-monitoring perspective and putting our best foot forward, because that is in the interest of the sector as well, all the players longer term. And that conviction is important, so no denying of that. And actually there's one other dimension that I want to point out. In very common everyday language parlance, when I think of ethical leadership, values is so deeply embedded to this whole concept that we need to understand. Look at folks around, and look at families around, and when I think of someone who is big, great, I think of the word khandan sometimes. We would have heard that in different contexts. And khandan doesn't necessarily imply someone who has a lot of money or X or Y resources. It has a very key piece embedded very strongly, and that is values. Similarly, in the context of organization, I was thinking, this morning in the context of the topic. So if someone if money, for example, were to be differentiated, a discerning criteria, would someone who wins a lottery of $1 billion overnight, become a leader in the eyes of the society and the world around? In a very limited, narrow context, maybe, but in the wider context, the way we understand, interpret, and would want it to be, perhaps not. Because this happens over a period of time. It is not just with a stroke of luck overnight. So these khandans or culture or values that are developed, built, deployed over a period of time and demonstrated for everyone. And that is key and differentiating. It comes from conviction, so completely.
Can I just add just to that?
Yeah, sure.
We talked about this also earlier, that the bottom line is no shortcut. This is something that you have to keep working on, and it's going to take years and years to do. Because for every example that you have of the sales manager who was pushing products to the CLFA agent in the last week to keep up the figures to take it back next month, and you take action on that person, you will have some people who slip through the cracks. So it is going to be a long haul. People will remember the people who slipped through the cracks rather than took action. Over a period of time, the people that you have made examples of to reinforce your values, over a period of time, those examples will set in. The other part is that attitude. You change my attitude and then my behavior changes. But that takes a long time. Right? So the other one is that if there is a change in behavior which is enforced, hopefully the attitude also changes. So we have to get used to saying that this is going to be for a long haul and this is not going to happen. It's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step backward.
Yeah. My view is on the NQ that was mentioned there. And I feel that as a corporates working in India, we have to follow acts or laws like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, and similar ones. All of us know for doing business, we at times have to, we call it consulting fees. We, find out ways of doing business and also following the laws. So my view is that how does leadership, and leadership knows these laws and still do business. One does certain things. I shouldn't call them bribery, but we term them as consulting fees. So is that what MQ, lower MQ meant? One thought is that. The other thought is as college, when we come out from colleges and we have high ideals and we say, this is right and this is wrong. We have studied about the ideals and role models and we know that this is right, this is wrong. Our value systems are not exposed so much to the real world. But as we go up the leadership ladder and we come across instances which are grey, we come across things which we call conflict of interest, and we also see what is not right in one corporate is right in the other corporate. I'll give an example, like if I'm going for an official tour, whether I take my spouse with me and do not incur the hotel expenditure and it's only one extra airfare, is that right? Many corporates it's right. In some corporates people are saying it's grey. So if I declare, it becomes right. If I don't declare, it becomes wrong. As a leader, I am not there to tell the 1,000 employees that I had declared. So somebody who didn't know that there was a declaration would say that this leader is wrong. He or she took his spouse or her spouse along with him.
So what's the question? So basically you're saying it has to be clearly defined. Is that your question?
So my question is, when as leaders the NQ is low, could be because we are dealing with more variety of experiences.
I'm really glad that I've kind of provoked the thought in your mind and you're actually questioning what MQ could possibly stand for. And my mind goes back in my leadership as a leadership consultant. I'm privy to a lot of companies and what really goes on internally there. And there is only one organization, a global organization, which is in biotechnology, which has been around for 100+ years. That actually there's a very interesting exercise. They said that we all assume we ought to have these values. Why don't we revisit what integrity means to us, what honesty means to us, and what trust means to us? And it is a very complex exercise in which I was a party for the whole thing. This is a company which is a global firm. It's across continents. So in China, in Beijing, we did this exercise where we got the top 30 leaders of the firm, flown from US, UK, everywhere across Europe, and they all sat down, 30 of them in a room. And for 3 days, they said, let's dedicate 1 day to honesty, 1 to trust, and 1 to integrity. And there were all kinds of nationalities in that the variables therein were like astounding. But you know, at the end of that one day, we kind of sat and collated our thoughts and said, what does integrity mean? So there are so many interpretations of integrity across the globe. There's so many interpretations of trust across the globe, and there's so many interpretations of honesty. That's what I took away. And finally, that exercise went ahead. For 3 months, they defined everything, which was a sort of a common platform globally on what it ought to be. And you're absolutely right, there's a grey line there. We make our own interpretation. Should I go ahead with my spouse? Everybody does it. Are the role models doing it? I don't know. But I want to do it. So do I let my value system be my compass there? Or does the organization take the trouble to revisit all of these, define them, and not just have a 30-page document that we sign, but do the highlights come out every now and then? And do we have people who kind of walk the talk on a common way? And then actually make way from that. I thought that was a fantastic exercise. And for 1 year after that, they went across the globe with that 3-day workshop or facilitation or whatever you may call it, initiative, saying let's revisit. The world has changed. We're all dealing with today's times. We may not want a definition of integrity that existed back then. So can we be real about it? So reality bites. I thought it was a wonderful exercise. I haven't seen any other organization actually revisit something as core as integrity, trust, or indeed honesty in that comprehensive manner, and then take out this document that everybody knew, everybody was on a common page. I thought that was a fabulous exercise, and I would really encourage and want organizations to at least embark on something like that. And I'm sure what I'm hearing from the panelists, from them, I think they do it in their own way, and I'm sure that maybe show results. So I'm not a pessimist, but yeah.
I saw there's a gentleman. Yeah,
question to Mr. Sanjay and Mr. Sen, this question is for you. For the one-to-one, for example, it's a global organization. For global organizations, how do you take values to the last man standing? Because there are different work locations, the culture is different. How do you ensure that the values we speak about are conveyed to the last man standing?
How do you convey the values to the last man standing in a global organization?
Thank you, because I was wanting to continue on to what Nina was saying. Similar to that example, those of you not familiar with our group, in 9 companies, and each of them are in different sectors. The past 2 years ago, we embarked on this, the process of knitting these companies together as a group, and we said what would be the common fabric, and one of the things were our values. So we have 3 values. One that will be relevant at this point of time was integrity. So we got that down, integrity as a value. We wrote down some pointers, and we said, okay, now let's get on with it. Let's embed these values. So just as an example that I'd like to use, we have a winding machine operator in our plant in Canada, and we have an accounts assistant in a plant in Malaysia. So that's the span. When we are talking to them about integrity, can they relate to integrity as a definition to their workplace? And that was when the fun began, because different frame of context, different job, different, how do you relate to integrity? Classic example, when you're talking of integrity, the first thing people say, oh, integrity, that means, do we have practices about, how do we get business, do we bribe? So it just stops at that. We said, no, hang on a moment, that's later. What about integrity inside? What is the commitment we have to each other? How do we operate with each other when we are dealing with each other? Commitment to our internal customer. So that started off a whole journey. We are still at that. We are still at the process of, and we realize that it's a huge exercise. We're in the process of translating to as many examples and as many cases as possible, as specific as possible. What is the definition of ethical behavior or integrity which anybody can relate with in their workplace. So it's a huge challenge. Again, it's a question of you take 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, because people have different understanding of the world. People are not able to relate with it. And how we counteract by that is again just constant reinforcement and communication. You look for examples of leaders, positive examples, and also examples that make a lot of difference. That must be like the classic sales manager who for 4 years got away with, doing, as I said, giving an example, got caught, action was taken, and that one example takes care of all, gives you the positive mileage for all the others. So it's okay, the organization is serious about it. But it's a long journey.
I hope that answers. You've been wanting to ask a question. Yes, and I cannot take more questions, so yours will be. Can somebody give him a mic, please?
Many years back, I was speaking with the CEO, and they were defining the values of the company, and it didn't have integrity. So I asked him that, why is integrity not part of your value system? He said, we are being realistic, we can't afford in our line of business. Now my question to you is that, between is the whole corporate world, I really don't know what sort of organization that would have built you, right? So is the corporate world really divided into two, that the leadership can play around with the North Ocean while you want the bulk of the organization to follow a certain straight line, because that's how you can control. So is there duplicity in the system itself?
I told you I'll give a very short answer. As I said, it's about intent. If the intent is not there, let's forget it. If the intent is there, then the process begins. So if a corporation chooses not to have integrity for whatever reason, that's a choice they take. Good luck.
So just to answer this a little differently. So there's this gentleman by the name of Hostel, and he's done this power distance index. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So in India per se, people do not take personal accountability because the power index is so large that you normally don't question. You kind of ethically take a lot of things for granted and move ahead, and you kind of squash your value system if there is going to be a clash. 1. 2 is that your individualism is at an all-time low as opposed to collectivism. So if you were to look at US, individually I want to be a whistleblower, I'm not going to hesitate. I will just go right ahead, and things are changing. So I'm not going to be the pessimist here. Things are changing. But how many people have the guts to stand up and become a whistleblower and do you give protection to the whistleblower? That's the ultimate question. I become the whistleblower and I'm turned out of the organization 4 months later. That's not the price I want to pay. So you're right. I mean, there are a lot of times when a lot of things in an organization stay within those closed doors, and till I'm sorry, pardon my French, but till something hits the ceiling, So there are times when incidences need to happen. There's so many classical examples. The LIC housing finance, there was the MD caught, integrity issue, etc., etc. Now the institution is larger than anything. The share index took a beating, but it recovered very soon because certain measures were taken, strong actions, and you have a situation where you've turned around. But the clash and the guy, Rajeev Dubey, I don't know what would have happened had he done a similar thing in India. Would he have got caught? I don't know, maybe it's an accepted norm. So there's also the cultural sensitivity on ethical issues. So there are multiple thoughts that I'm raising here, but I think we are sort of different. So what ethical leadership could mean to us here in India could be significantly different from what it may mean to the companies in the